stories, and I think everybody there was moved to tears. And I thought as I came out, I thought, I just wish there was something I could do to help.
There was no announcement and no statement, but what happened at the estate quickly changed the mood inside the palace. Something strange happened behind palace walls while the king was out of sight. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet movements that almost went unnoticed. Almost. Because what began as subtle access turned into a situation serious enough to trigger a royal shutdown and the fallout reshaped. Who holds power behind the scenes? At first, it didn't look like a scandal at all. Reports suggest Camilla's son, Tom Parker Bowles, was simply present more often, a little closer to the inner circle than before. Seen at gatherings, walking corridors usually reserved for senior royals. Nothing announced, nothing explained. But in a place where every step is measured, repetition alone can send a message. And this message didn't sit right with everyone watching. To understand why it raised alarms, you have to go back decades. Long before titles and crowns settled into place, Charles and Camilla's relationship carried unfinished business that never truly stayed in the past. It's been said their children grew up on opposite sides of a story the public never stopped judging. Some insiders believe Camilla felt that weight deeply, that her children had lived quietly, cautiously, while others inherited certainty. And over time, that belief may have hardened into resolve. According to reports, the approach wasn't bold or official. It was subtle. Tom wasn't given a role or a title. Instead, he was given space. Appearing where the heir had just been, standing in rooms that carried symbolic weight, staff hesitated, then adjusted. A chair moved. A schedule shifted. On their own, harmless. Together, unsettling. The line between presence and position began to blur. What made it more complicated was how the access worked. It's been said much of it wasn't written down. No formal approvals, just quiet assurances, a sense that instructions carried authority because of where they came from. Over time, staff reportedly stopped questioning it. Familiarity did the work. And that's when things crossed into dangerous territory. The moment everything changed centered on a private estate, one rarely used, carefully protected, especially while the king was receiving medical treatment. Reports suggest Tom entered without formal clearance, issued instructions, adjusted rooms, nothing destructive, nothing dramatic, but enough to leave a paper trail where none should exist. And somewhere in the background, someone noticed. That someone was Prince Edward. Often overlooked, rarely loud, but deeply experienced in how royal procedure actually works. Instead of confronting anyone, he documented everything: dates, access points, irregular permissions. It's been said he waited deliberately, knowing that evidence, not emotion, would decide what happened next. By the time others sensed resistance, the record was already complete. Once the findings reached the right hands, the response was immediate. Prince William moved quickly and quietly. Access was reviewed. Informal privileges were revoked. Doors that had stayed open for years closed overnight. Even long-standing exceptions tied to Camilla's relatives were reportedly removed. No public statements. No spectacle. Just order snapping back into place. The shift was felt instantly. Tom's presence faded from spaces where it had become routine. Staff no longer hesitated before asking for approval. What once felt normal suddenly felt impossible. And Camilla, according to insiders, found her influence sharply limited, not through confrontation, but through procedure. The very thing she couldn't bend. In the end, the message was clear. Ambition can exist near the crown. Influence can grow quietly. But anything that even appears to challenge the line of succession triggers absolute resistance. This wasn't about punishment. It was about boundaries. And the palace, having come dangerously close to overlooking one, made sure it wouldn't happen again. What nearly worked may be the most important part of this story. Because the monarchy didn't just correct a breach. It learned how close it came to letting perception replace permission. And that lesson won't be forgotten anytime soon. What lingered afterward wasn't anger. It was caution. The palace returned to its usual rhythm, but something had changed beneath the surface. Procedures tightened. Oversight increased. Informal habits that had once been tolerated were quietly dismantled. The system corrected itself, not with noise, but with precision. For Tom, the silence was the loudest part. There was no formal accusation, No public reckoning, just absence. Invitations stopped arriving. Familiar corridors felt distant again. The authority he'd grown accustomed to vanished, as if it had never existed. What he had believed was momentum revealed itself as something far more fragile. Access without sanction has no memory. Camilla, according to reports, understood the outcome immediately. Not because anyone explained it to her, but because the doors told the story. Influence she once exercised through timing and familiarity no longer worked. The palace had closed ranks, and once that happens, there's no appeal, not even for a queen. Prince Edward faded back into the background, his role complete. He didn't need recognition. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do when tested, and William emerged not louder, but firmer. His response sent a message that didn't need repeating. The air does not share space, not symbolically, not quietly, not ever. What makes this episode so unsettling isn't what happened. It's how close it came to continuing. Reports suggest that if the estate incident hadn't occurred, the pattern might have gone on unnoticed. That's the real warning. Not about one person, but about how power can shift without anyone declaring it. The monarchy survived this moment intact, but it didn't ignore it. The quiet lesson now lives in tightened rules, shorter leashes, and fewer assumptions. Presence alone no longer carries weight, and anyone watching closely knows this wasn't just a correction. It was a reset, because in a system built on tradition, the most dangerous moves are never loud. They're the ones that almost feel normal. And that reset changed how everyone moved afterward. Conversations became more deliberate. Permissions were double-checked. Long-standing habits were questioned for the first time in years. The palace didn't just return to order, it became alert. The kind of alert that comes from realizing how quietly things can slip, insiders say. This moment reshaped trust inside the family. Not in a dramatic, emotional way, but in a structural one. Who can be where? Who speaks for whom? And how quickly influence can be misread as entitlement. Nothing was said publicly, but the internal lines were redrawn with clarity. What's striking is how little noise it made outside the walls. No headlines, no statements. Just a sudden absence of someone who had once been everywhere. That, more than anything, revealed how carefully the correction was handled. The goal wasn't embarrassment, it was containment. Some reports suggest this episode hardened William's view of leadership. That authority can't rely on assumption, even inside family, especially inside family. And that, protecting the future of the institution, sometimes means acting before the public ever knows there was a risk. Camilla's position didn't disappear, but it narrowed. Influence that once flowed through subtle channels now meets resistance at every turn. Not hostility, just rules. And rules, once enforced, are difficult to bypass again. What remains is an unspoken understanding inside the palace. That proximity to power is not power itself, that repetition doesn't equal permission, and that the monarchy watches most closely when no one thinks it's looking. This story didn't end with a confrontation or a confession. It ended with silence, with doors closing, with routines changing, and with a clear reminder that in the royal system, the most serious warnings are the ones delivered without a single word. And that silence carried further than anyone expected. Because once the palace corrects something quietly, it doesn't reopen the conversation. It moves on. That's how power protects itself. By refusing to revisit what it has already decided, people close to the situation say, the atmosphere never fully went back to what it was before. There was a sense that something invisible had passed through the walls, a reminder that the system isn't just ceremonial, it's responsive. And when pressure builds in the wrong place, it pushes back hard. What made this episode especially sobering was how ordinary it looked while it was happening. No demands, no announcements, just presence becoming familiarity, familiarity becoming assumption, and assumption edging toward entitlement. That's how lines get crossed in institutions built on tradition. For William, the lesson was clear. The future doesn't protect itself. It has to be guarded. Even from well-intentioned closeness, even from family. And once that realization sets in, leadership stops being symbolic and becomes operational. For Camilla, it appears the moment marked a quiet limit. Not a public fall, but a boundary she could feel every day afterward. The palace didn't argue with her. It simply stopped responding the way it used to. Influence that depends on subtlety can disappear the moment the room changes. And for Tom, the experience became a harsh education in how proximity works at the top. Being near power is intoxicating. It feels earned quickly. But when the structure withdraws support, there's nothing to hold on to. The floor gives way without warning. The palace absorbed the shock and adjusted. That's what it's designed to do. It doesn't panic. It doesn't explain. It corrects. Then it watches to see who understands the correction. And perhaps that's the final takeaway. In the monarchy, you don't always get told when you've gone too far. You find out when the doors stop opening, when your name no longer appears, when silence replaces access, because the crown doesn't end once those limits are enforced. There's no negotiation phase. No second explanation. The palace doesn't rewind to clarify intent. It assumes understanding. If you don't adjust, you simply fade further out of reach. That's why those closest to the situation say the most telling detail wasn't the removal of access, but how fast it happened. One day, routines felt normal. The next, they were gone. That speed sent a message louder than any confrontation ever could. This wasn't a warning. It was a decision. Behind the scenes, the system that allowed flexibility was quietly redesigned. Informal approvals were replaced with written ones. Verbal authority lost its weight. Staff were reminded politely, firmly, who answers to whom. The palace didn't just close a door. It reinforced the frame around it. What makes this moment linger is the realization of how fragile influence really is. It doesn't vanish because of scandal. It vanishes because attention shifts, because oversight returns, because someone decides the risk is no longer worth tolerating. Those watching closely believe this episode will echo for years, not as gossip, but as precedent, a reminder that even proximity to the throne doesn't grant immunity, that even patience, when paired with quiet ambition, can trigger resistance. And the irony is impossible to miss. The very subtlety that allowed the situation to grow is what ultimately exposed it. The palace isn't threatened by noise. It's threatened by quiet normalization. And once that pattern is detected, the response is absolute. In the end, nothing was announced. No blame was assigned publicly. The monarchy remained steady. But the message traveled anyway, carried through absence and silence. Some lines don't need to be defended loudly. They just need to be enforced, once ounce its limits, and that single enforcement reshaped behavior more effectively than any speech ever could. Because inside the palace, memory is long. People adjust not to what's said, but to what happens when rules are tested. This moment became one of those quiet reference points everyone remembers, even if no one names it. Those who were closest to the family reportedly became more cautious overnight. Not fearful, just precise. Authority was clarified. Assumptions were questioned. The unspoken hierarchy, once softened by familiarity, hardened again into structure. The system reminded everyone that it only bends when it chooses to end. It straightens just as easily. What's unsettling is how icily it could have gone further. That's the part insiders still reflect on. Not with panic, but with realism. If the estate hadn't drawn attention, if documentation hadn't existed, if oversight had stayed distracted just a little longer, the outcome might have been very different. That realization changed how risk is viewed at the top. Quiet ambition is no longer seen as harmless. Presence is no longer neutral. Repetition is no longer invisible. Every step is now measured against intent, not appearance. And that makes the palace a colder place, but a safer one. For the monarchy, this wasn't a crisis. It was a correction. A recalibration of boundaries before they fractured. And that's why it mattered so much. Institutions don't collapse from dramatic attacks. They weaken from subtle erosion. This time, the erosion was caught. Nothing about this story ends with resolution in the traditional sense. There's no apology, no reconciliation scene, just a new normal that feels slightly tighter than before, slightly quieter, slightly more controlled. And maybe that's the final truth. Power doesn't always roar when it's challenged. Sometimes it waits, watches, documents, then acts once and never explains itself again. Because in the palace, the most serious decisions are the ones you never hear about. And that unseen decision continues to ripple outward in ways most people will never notice. Not through headlines, but through habits. Through who gets copied on messages. Through who is asked to wait. Through which doors quietly remain locked. even when no one is watching. People inside the palace say the atmosphere became more disciplined, almost overnight. Not tense, just sharper. Staff who once relied on instinct now relied on confirmation. Long-standing routines were reviewed with fresh eyes. Even trusted shortcuts were questioned. The system didn't accuse anyone. It simply recalibrated. What stands out is how quickly memory settled in, not the memory of what happened, but the memory of what followed. Access removed. Influence cut off. Silence where permission once existed. That sequence burned itself into the culture. It became a reference point no one needed to mention aloud. And the lesson wasn't limited to one household. It traveled across the institution. Anyone operating near power felt it. If proximity could be mistaken for authority once, it wouldn't be again. The palace had learned something about itself, and it adjusted accordingly. There's a reason. This story never exploded publicly. Exposure wasn't the goal. Stability was. The monarchy survives by absorbing disruption internally before it ever reaches the outside world. That's how it maintains the illusion of continuity. Even when internal currents shift dramatically, leadership isn't inherited in practice. It's exercised. And when it is, it must be unmistakable. His response didn't rely on emotion or explanation. It relied on action. Clean, final, irreversible. Observers say that afterward, nothing felt chaotic, but nothing felt loose either. The palace felt like it had closed ranks not against a person, but against uncertainty. The future was protected not by tradition alone, but by vigilance. Camilla's experience, according to those familiar with the aftermath, became quieter, more contained. Her role remained visible, but her reach was shortened, not as punishment, as correction. Influence that once flowed through informal channels now encountered formal stops. And once those stops exist, momentum disappears. Tom's withdrawal from inner spaces wasn't dramatic. It was almost surgical. One access point at a time, one routine at a time, until what remained was distance, not hostility. Just separation, the kind that leaves no room for confusion. And that's what makes this story linger, not the rumor, not the speculation, but the precision, the realization that the most powerful systems don't react impulsively. They wait until the response can be absolute. In the end, the palace didn't need to defend the line of succession. It simply reinforced it. And by doing so quietly, it reminded everyone watching inside and out that the most dangerous shifts are the ones that feel ordinary. While they're happening, that's why this moment matters more than it seems. It wasn't a scandal. It was a stress test. And the system passed. Because when power is real, it doesn't argue. It adjusts. It enforces them.